Hey class, in this video lecture, we'll discuss best practices for email. We'll start out by discussing why you should choose email. Under what circumstances is email the most appropriate medium for your message? Second, we'll talk about subject lines and how to write them well. Third, we'll talk about salutations, closings, and tone in email. Fourth, we'll talk about email structure and content. And finally, we'll look at some sample emails, some bad sample emails, honestly. We'll identify their errors, and then we'll try to fix them. So let's start by discussing why you should choose email. Under what circumstances email is the best medium for your message. Now, if you haven't watched the Choosing Your Medium video lecture yet, please go do so. A lot of the content here will review that video lecture. But the main thing I want to emphasize is that we should not default to written communication. And we definitely shouldn't default to email. If we do choose email, we should do so consciously with a full awareness of its pros and cons. On the plus side, email provides a written record of communication. It's widely accessible. Most people have an email address. It's easy to respond to, and it's easy to retrieve. On the negative side, however, it's a public message. It can find its way into the hands of secondary and tertiary audiences, if not the broader public altogether. It's easy to misread, and it's a high volume medium. So to summarize those pros and cons, to distill those lists down to a few quick takeaways, generally speaking, email is great for setting up meetings. It's great for asking questions, and it's great for conveying simple information. It's bad for any complex, sensitive message. If you need to convey a complex or sensitive message, you should probably seek out an alternative medium. So perhaps the most important thing to keep in mind with all of this is to always be aware of the potential secondary and tertiary audiences for email. Just because you're writing to person A doesn't mean that person A can't forward that message to person B or person C, right? So don't put anything in writing that you don't potentially want secondary and tertiary audiences to see. Now let's talk about subject lines and how to craft them effectively. So when you're crafting your subject line, you want to make sure that you're using polite, action-oriented language. My favorite way to approach subject lines is by using polite questions and polite commands. Polite commands are things like please verb, please send me the report by 3 p.m. Polite questions would be something like could you please verb, could you please send me the report by 3 p.m. Both of these approaches are polite, but they're also direct. They're very action-oriented. You also want to keep your subject lines short, ideally to 60 characters or fewer, including spaces. By keeping your subject lines short, you will ensure that the bulk, if not the entirety of your subject line, appears in the preview pane on your reader's email client, whether that's something like Outlook or on their smartphone. And then lastly, you want to include dates in your subject lines where appropriate to indicate urgency. Avoid just putting words like urgent or important. Those actually just make your subject line sound spammy. A far more effective way to signal urgency is, again, where appropriate, to include a deadline or a date in your subject line. Next, let's talk about salutations, closings, and tone. First thing, you should use salutations and closings in all of your email communication. This will help personalize your message and identify your audience. Now, some of you who are more conversant with text message communication might regard opening and closing salutations as kind of old-fashioned, but at least in email, they're really useful. The opening salutation, it indicates who the primary audience of your message is, right? Imagine that you're sending an email to a listserv, but you really just want a response from 3 or 4 people on that listserv. Use the opening salutation to very clearly specify your primary audience. Opening salutations are great for that. You can then use your closing salutation to clearly divide the end of your email from the beginning of the next email, right? Imagine that you're looking at a big printed out document that contains a long email thread. Those opening and closing salutations will very clearly signal to future you or another reader, another user, when the message begins and when it ends, okay? Quick tip, make sure that at least in your opening salutation, you're double checking the spelling of your reader's name. I'm sensitive to this because people are constantly misspelling both my first and my last name, so I figured I'd mention it here. I also figured this is a good occasion to remind you all that my name is spelled Trainor, not Trainer. Next, and this will be familiar to you if you've already watched the video lecture on business style and business diction, make sure that you include specific targeted goodwill statements at the end of your message. You typically want to begin with your main point, but you want to devote the last few lines of your message to developing relationships with your audience through those goodwill statements. In those goodwill statements, you want to avoid stock phrases and cliches. These kinds of statements encourage readers to view your message as disposable. So instead, replace statements like, I hope this finds you well, or don't hesitate to contact me with any questions or concerns. Replace those with more personalized, more tailored statements. These kinds of personalized, tailored statements will make your reader feel valued, and it will make your message feel specific. You also want to maintain the right level of formality. You don't want to be too informal. You also don't want to be too formal. You want to be somewhere in the range of business casual. You want your language to wear khakis and wear a button down. Along similar lines, you want to avoid cliches, slang, jargon, text speak, and emojis. Cliches, text speak, emojis, slang, they will make your message sound too informal, and jargon will make your message sound too formal, as well as just incomprehensible. You want to be earnest in your email communication. Sarcasm is really hard to read in written communication, so make sure that you're banishing sarcasm, particularly from emails. And you want to avoid putting insults or rude comments in writing. Remember, email is a public medium. Your message can wind up in the hands of secondary and tertiary audiences, so don't write down anything that you don't potentially want the whole world to see. Now let's talk about email structure and content. So the most important thing to keep in mind is that you should always limit yourself to one main topic per message. If you find yourself writing an email and it clearly has more than one topic, that's a signal that you need to send multiple emails or that you need to break up your message across multiple mediums. You want to use your email to motivate action. One of the most important things that you can do before sending an email is asking yourself what you want your reader to do. Once you've answered that question, make sure that you begin your message by motivating action, by telling your reader what you want them to do, even if that action is as simple as reviewing some information. In general, you want to write short, front-loaded, visually appealing messages. You want to open with your main point, right? So that's what I mean by front-loaded messages. Just get straight into your main point in email. You want to break your message into short, easy-to-read paragraphs. That will ensure that your message is visually appealing. You want to write from your reader's perspective, not your own. That will ensure that your message is reader-focused. You want to think carefully about what your reader does and does not know. You don't want to provide too much context, and you also don't want to provide too little context. You want to include only need-to-know information. Get rid of any extraneous junk. And then lastly, and perhaps most obviously, proof read carefully. Grammar and style errors, those compromise your credibility. So make sure that you're catching all of them before you hit that send button. Now let's look at some sample emails and think about how we can fix the errors in these sample emails. So here's our first example. Subject line, freaking Dave, LOL, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. I hope you're doing good, emoticon. Freaking Dave asked me to develop an outreach thing for a new client. Can you believe that guy? A whole mess of exclamation points and question marks. Emoticon, I'm so freaking busy right now, emoticon. Anyway, could you send me that script you worked on a while back, emoticon? Also, you thinking about applying to that new coordinator position? I hear that Beth is interested, emoticon, but you'd def be better than here. Peace. So that's a bad email. But let's interrogate why it's bad. So first of all, it's got a terrible subject line. It's not particularly informative. It's not action-oriented. It's not using that please verb or could you please verb format that we talked about earlier. It also doesn't have opening and closing salutations. So it's not clearly identifying the beginning and end of the message. It's not clearly identifying the primary audience for the message. It has crappy goodwill, and it begins with goodwill, right? Remember, you want good, personalized, tailored goodwill, and you want it to appear at the end of your message. It's got a lot of informal junk scattered throughout. So we've got those emoticons. We've got that very informal sort of text speak punctuation. We've got a lot of insulting or abusive language here that we wouldn't want our secondary or tertiary audiences to see. Imagine if this email were forwarded to freaking Dave or to Beth. They would not be pleased to see this message. The message also has a lot of proofreading errors scattered throughout. It's written from the writer's perspective rather than the reader's perspective. It has more than one point, right? The message is both about freaking Dave, and it's also about the coordinator position. And perhaps the most important sin of this message is that the main point is buried in the middle of the message. It's not front-loaded. So how could we fix this? We could fix this, of course, by eliminating all of these errors, but also by rewriting the message as follows. Subject line, please send Acme Outreach script by 12/1. Hi, Maddie. By this Tuesday, 12/1, could you please send me the outreach script we used last November when we pitched our services to Acme? Dave asked me to develop a new outreach strategy for a potential client, and I'd like to build on your outstanding work. Thanks, Claude. Now let's look at another problematic example. And this is problematic in a very different way. So first of all, this message fails to provide necessary context, okay? So indicate your availability for what? It also doesn't clearly specify that the underlying text consists of links. And then finally, it assumes that the reader knows how to use when to meet polls, all right? So in this case, we actually want to make our message a bit longer to provide our reader with the context they need to engage with this message successfully. So here's how I would revise it. Again, I won't read this whole message from beginning to end, but please take a moment to engage with this message, read it fully, and think about how we've supplied more information for our readers. So to summarize, email is great for setting up meetings, it's great for asking questions, and it's great for conveying sample information. It's bad for any complex, sensitive message. Keep these pros and cons in mind along with some of our style, structure, and content tips, and you will be well on your way to writing very effective emails. Thanks for watching.